Another wardrobe change, because apparently recording this lecture in one sitting just isn't happening. Uh, so here we are on the third day of recording for this lecture. Hey. So let's dive into the ancient period. This is a period of human history, so called because writing becomes a thing during this period. And so now we have a historical record where things were written down that goes from about circa 2900 BCE. That date is fuzzy and not always easy to figure out because what the things that sort of mark the ancient period don't arrive in all places throughout the globe at the same time. And it ends at a definitive date, 476 CE. Right? That's a very specific date. And there's a reason for that, but we'll talk about that a bit later in the semester. The ancient period. And specifically, we're going to take a look at the beginnings of civilization. Now, that term, civilization, comes from the Latin word civilis, meaning a city or citizen. So, what brings this about? Well, then those Neolithic developments that we talked about, agriculture and the domestication of animals, made cities possible for sure. But also there was the invention of bronze. This was an alloy of, or is an alloy of copper and tin that peoples at the late, as the Stone Age was sort of coming to an end, that people figured out how to smelt these two metals together. And this led to the Bronze Age, an age that allowed people to create metal tools and weapons, leaving those stone tools and weapons behind, at least in the part of the world that we're talking about. It was also the period that gave us the earliest writing systems that we know of. And this, just as much as agriculture, made cities possible. The fact that we could make tools and artwork, for that matter, as we'll see, out of bronze. How do we mark when civilization has arrived in a particular area? Well, historians like to look at a few things and say, all right, once we see these things happening, we know that civilization has arrived in a region. First off, division of labor. Division of labor means that we're starting to divide up our society based on labor as opposed to just status. So you have those who are responsible for working the land. You have sort of the priestly classes, the governmental classes, those who are the laborers who build the buildings and create the goods and services, right? And then again, there are those who provide services, right? This is a division of society based on classes, and those classes being based on the type of labor that one does. That's a marker of civilization. An organized government, organized religion, oftentimes a government-sanctioned religion. It may be part of that as well. Organized arts and crafts, right? That they become organized. There becomes a certain type of training which keeps the arts consistent within a civilization, things of that nature. Exploration of the sciences, and again, very importantly, written language. Written language often is a marker that civilization has arrived in a region. And we are going to talk about the two earliest highly organized civilizations, ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. That's what we'll dive into. It's ancient Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a term that literally translates to the land between the rivers. And the two rivers in question are the Tigris and the Euphrates. You can see them here and here. The land between and around these rivers, known as the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, allowed civilization to flourish in this particular area, right? So this Fertile Crescent here, and you can see that it sort of comes down and includes the area of what would have been ancient Palestine. So when we think about, let's say, the Judeo-Christian Bible, and particularly the creation story in the book of Genesis. Now, I'm not asking anyone who may be watching this video to sort of question their religious beliefs. All right? That's not my intent here at all. However, whether you think of the creation story and the Garden of Eden as being literally true, everything that was written actually happened, or whether you see them as that story as being allegorical, it makes a certain kind of sense that two of the three rivers that are said to run through the Garden of Eden were the Tigris and the Euphrates, because the people of the region that we get our Judeo-Christian Bible from would have seen this area, the Fertile Crescent, as the area where their ancestors would have come from, right? And so it makes sense to sort of place the earliest of creation, the first human, the first man, first woman in that region. These civilizations, the civilizations of Mesopotamia, break down into three main kingdoms. We could dive into the things that happen in between, but we're going to talk about three sort of main kingdoms. The first one being Sumer, and its dates of existence are listed there for you. Akkad, and its dates of existence are listed there for you. And Babylon, and its dates of existence are listed there for you. Historians, when talking about Sumer, often say that history begins at Sumer. It was an extremely early civilization, and it gave us much of what we depend upon today. The Sumerians developed the world's first writing that we can find, the earliest that we know of. They invented the wheel, and the plow. So this is one of the places where agriculture really was innovated. They were all about seeking a just and stable society based on laws, codes, and cultural enrichment. And those are things that we hold dear to this day, right? Because again, you got to think about what has happened, right? As hunter-gatherer cultures have become agrarian and have begun to really settle down into cities, right? We need structure, right? Because we've got lots and lots of human beings who are suddenly being forced to live in close proximity to one another. And that causes problems. So we need laws and codes, things that say, okay, as a people, these are our values. These are the things that we value. And we are going to hold all of the people who live under our society, we're going to hold them to these rules and these laws and this code of conduct. That idea is Sumerian in nature. Akkad then conquered Sumer. Well, you see that the dates are later for that. But they also they conquered Sumer, but they also incorporated a lot of Sumerian culture and built upon it. They acquired this large empire. As a result, they started conquering the areas all around them. And their first ruler, Sargon, interestingly has a legend very similar to Moses. It's very similar. He was even placed in a basket and floated down a river as a baby, not unlike Moses. Then Babylon built upon those earlier cultures. And really sort of launched into some empire building of its own. And Hammurabi, the Babylonians' greatest leader, is someone that you'll hear about in the lecture that you'll get from Professor McIntosh. Let's look at an example of Sumerian artistry. This Sumerian lyre right? The part of this that is genuinely ancient Sumerian is the head and this panel that goes on the front of the lyre. The actual lyre, which would have been a stringed instrument, very similar to a harp. The stuff back here, this is modern. This has been built to be for these things to be attached to for display purposes. But this would have been built circa 2685 BCE. The plaque we have over here so that we can see it in much more detail. Now, in the Sumerian kingdom, this is one of the first places where art becomes a profession. Right? Not just something that we sort of make to beautify our homes, like that anybody is making. It is a division of labor. The artisans become one sort of class of people within Sumerian culture. So training gets passed down from a master to an apprentice. This is something that we'll see later on happening in history as well. The patrons of the arts were either wealthy individuals, the local government, or officials who were commissioning work for the temples within Sumer. And they have this in the Sumerian kingdom, this beautiful, bold, simple style that, similar to what we saw happening in some of the Neolithic art that we looked at, blends naturalism and abstraction. Well, if we look at, say, the head here on this lyre, right, it is an interesting blend of naturalism and abstraction. The naturalism comes in with the bull's head itself. Right, this bull's head has been made to look extremely observational. Right, it is meant to look naturalistically like an actual bull's head. Right. But then the sort of beard that has been added to it, which, by the way, would have been sort of the style of Sumerians at the time, Sumerian men, is very abstract. It's very flat. It's almost like it's just been like glued on, right? It's a flat thing that has sort of been inscribed into, right? And this is very abstract, right? And it's this blending that we'll see in a lot of Sumerian artwork. Bulls were believed to possess supernatural powers in Sumer, and this would have been commissioned to play music in a place to accompany storytellers who would have told the old religious stories. Right? This plate then sort of gives a visual illustration to a story that would have been told about heroes and gods. And this, as it says, a visual representation of what might have been told by those storytellers. Then we get to Akkad. We get to the Akkadian Empire. And we get this piece right here. The Akkadians, again, as I said, built on Sumerian culture. And so a lot of their artwork also sort of blends naturalism and abstraction. We'll see this happening in their work as well. This is the head of an Akkadian ruler that was found in Nineveh, would have been sculpted circa 2300 to 2200 BCE, somewhere in that period. And it is a bronze bust. Bronze being that new metal that we're talking about that people are using in this time period. And a bust just meaning a sculpture of the head. Right? If you ever see a sculpture that's just the head, or maybe at most the head and the shoulders, that is something we refer to as a bust. And as I mentioned, this demonstrates the Akkadian culture's incorporation of Sumerian culture. So, for instance, the face of this ruler, these things here show a close observation and attention to observable detail, proportions, etc. We get the sense that we're looking at an artist who probably had the ruler himself sit in front of him and is working very hard to recreate in a naturalistic way what his eyes are observing. That artist, however, also incorporates simplified, abstract representations of hair or the beard or the sort of braids that sort of come around here, right? So there's this very simplified geometric way of sort of inscribing lines up here. The hair that would make up the curls of hair that would be coming out from under the headdress are done in these very abstract geometric ways as well. And even the curls of the hair, which have at least a little more detail to them, but are still given this very abstract look. The most prominent feature of any Mesopotamian city would have been the ziggurat. This, in particular, being the ziggurat, the Great Ziggurat of Ur, as it's often called, that is located in present-day Iraq, and would have been built circa 2100 BCE. A ziggurat is sort of a terraced brick pyramid. Terraced means it's sort of in stacked layers, and each layer is a bit smaller than the one below it, so that terraces are created on the way up. And it served as the center of worship in any Mesopotamian city, and would have been the tallest thing in the city, so that it could be seen from all around. And it was usually topped by a temple. This one is, of course, in ruins. We don't have the upper terraces of this particular ziggurat. We have these lower terraces that still exist. This is an artist's rendition of what the ziggurat of Ur might have looked like. This is by an artist named Frank Zhang. This is a watercolor he did in 2017. And so this showcases how that ziggurat of Ur may have originally looked. And on top, we see that there is a temple to Nana, the moon god. Now, ziggurats were always aligned with the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, west. This would have been aligned along those. A series of terraces and staircases. And it's believed that these were meant to get human beings as close as possible to the gods, right? The temple is way up here, or perhaps they were thought of as a way for gods to descend to the earth, right? So either one would get up here and petitions to the gods could be done as close as possible to them, or maybe this was up here really high so that the gods could sort of descend to earth and descend down these staircases. Certainly there was the religious component, right? That temple is there at the top, but there would have also been government official buildings, or not buildings, but offices rather, that would have been located here as well. The priestly class would have had their offices in here as well, because it was the center of culture, both religious and governmental, for any Mesopotamian city of the time. There are historians who have said that perhaps, again, if we look back at the Judeo-Christian Bible and we look at, again, some of the stories from the book of Genesis, we get that story of the Tower of Babel, right? The story goes that the people of Babel were building this tower, and their plan was to build it so high that they could reach God. It's believed that perhaps the idea of the Tower of Babel was inspired by peoples of this time hearing stories of the Babylonian and Mesopotamian ziggurats, right, that were built high up to reach the gods. Our second ancient complex civilization that we will talk about is ancient Egypt. You know what? Let me kind of go back real quickly. I forgot to mention something about the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent, these rivers come through this area, making this area very fertile, hence why agriculture began in this region. But what also helped this region to foster civilization is that it was also protected by mountains to the north and desert to the south. I mentioned that because when we get to ancient Egypt, we have the fertile Nile River, which was in its case protected by desert on both sides. That allowed civilization to flourish in this narrow strip of land that follows the Nile River in Egypt. Now, when we speak of the art and architecture of Egypt developed these distinctive styles of art that remain relatively unchanged for 2,500 years. 2,500 years is an incredible amount of time for there to be these in the case of Egypt, uh, government sanctioned rules on how art was to be made, and that these remain fairly unchanged. There's small changes here and there, but you look at some artwork from the earliest days of ancient Egypt, and then look at artwork 2,500 years later, and they look very similar. That this sort of style was hung on to for so long and was enforced really for so long. Egyptian religious belief focused intensely on the afterlife, preservation of the body, and care for the dead. And a couple of important contributions of the Egyptians that are passed down to us are things like the 12-month calendar, and each month having 30 days. That was an Egyptian creation. And the idea of medical research, right? Because again, the Egyptians were so obsessed with the importance of preserving the body, there was a lot of research that was done into how the human body operates, how it works, what functions go on in here, so that they could figure out how to preserve those things as best they could for burial. But there, a lot of their discoveries that were made as a result of this research has been passed down to us now, and much of our medical practice, even to this day, was built upon a lot of the discoveries of the Egyptians. There are two regions of ancient Egypt, right? There is Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. Now, don't be confused, because Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, because of the arrangement of north to south, it seems counterintuitive, because Upper Egypt is down here and Lower Egypt is further north. But they're referred to as Upper and Lower Egypt based on whether they were upstream or downstream on the Nile. And the Nile flows from south to north, right, emptying up out into this big delta into the Mediterranean Sea. So if we go upstream, we arrive at Upper Egypt, and if we go downstream, we arrive at Lower Egypt, right? So there are these two main regions, and there were three main periods of ancient Egypt. There was what is referred to as the Old Kingdom. You have its dates listed there. You have the Middle Kingdom and its dates, which are listed there, and what is referred to as the New Kingdom, right? These are three main periods of ancient Egyptian history. It's not as if ancient Egypt disappears after the New Kingdom, right? The Egyptian civilization continued on after this, but in a different state from where it was in what was 10,079 BCE. We can't talk about ancient Egypt without talking about the pyramids, right? The true pyramid, which emerges with King Khufu's Great Pyramid, right? So here we have the Great Pyramids are these three. There are these smaller ones here that were dedicated to people who weren't necessarily kings of Egypt. Down here we have the Pyramid of Menkaure, built in 2525 BCE, the period of Khafre, 2544 BCE, and the Pyramid of Khufu, built in 2580 BCE. So we have the three pyramids built by granddad, dad, and grandson, right? These three pyramids that have been built. These men were kings of Egypt. The word pharaoh that you probably often associate with the kings of Egypt had not been developed yet. But these particular men placed themselves as being god kings, right? That they were somehow this combination of divinity, right, on earth. And that was what gave them then the authority to rule. The pyramids, particularly the Great Pyramid, is still the largest stone building in the world. And this complex is made up of the burial monuments of Khufu and his two successors, but also the smaller ones would have been for like wives and concubines, things of that nature. The pyramids were designed and constructed with extreme mathematical precision as burial monuments that sit above the burial chambers of each of these rulers. These became then the symbol of the Old Kingdom. We think about the pyramids as being very related to Egyptian, but they were actually being built during a very short and very early period of ancient Egyptian history. Right? These wouldn't be made for a huge amount of time, and there's a reason for that we can kind of begin to realize when we look at the Sphinx that was also carved during the Old Kingdom. It was carved to guard this complex of the Great Pyramids in Giza. The Sphinx is a mythical creature with the body of a lion and the head of a human, sometimes a man, sometimes a woman. In this case, it appears to be a man. Now, it's believed that the Sphinx's purpose was to ward off thieves and vandals, right? Why does it need to guard it? Well, because just look at it. Whatever else the pyramids may have been, they are certainly a gigantic marker that says, hey, are you looking for gold and treasure beyond your wildest imagination? Well, look here. It's all right here for you. And so from the moment that these pyramids were put into place, there were thieves trying to get in there and steal what they could. So you have the Sphinx there guarding things. Because again, the inside of the pyramids are meant as burial chambers, right? And so, all right, so out here, right, they have the original pyramid themselves with a layer that would have been put on the outside, right? So, okay, all right, let's go back to the image, right? All right, so we see the pyramids now with all this exposed brick, but originally they were covered in a layer that we think may have even been alabaster white, making these things just absolutely gleam in the sun, right? Then within the pyramid itself, we have these corridors that lead to different chambers, one of which, at the entrance here, leads us down to a false tomb. This was a tomb that was built underground beneath the pyramids for the very purpose of, and it seems to have done its job well, right? Because there are a couple of tunnels that were dug by thieves, and they went for it. They went for the chamber that was meant to be the one that was meant to trick people, like get down here and then get trapped underground. But we have the chamber that was actually the king's chamber, where the king was buried, up here. And we have what the so-called queen's chamber, because it was believed when it was first discovered that perhaps the queen was put down here, but we're not so certain about that anymore. But anyway, we do know that, and this is what the Egyptians are famous for. Of course, you already know it. We know that the Egyptians were famous for mummification, for preserving the bodies and of their kings and pharaohs. This being one of them. This is the tomb of Tutankhamun, who was born in a much later period than the Old Kingdom. So he was buried in the Valley of the Kings, not under any pyramid. Pharaohs were being buried in the Valley of the Kings, where they were less likely to have their tombs looted. But this is the kind of thing that you would have seen. You would have seen a mummified pharaoh or king. Much later in Egyptian culture, in Egyptian history, you would also have people in higher society, the wealthy. Those people would also be allowed to be mummified and buried in this way, right? They placed in a sarcophagus, placed in a burial chamber, where you can see all of these paintings around them. The Egyptian mythology is extremely interesting, and Egyptians were very, very focused on what awaited them in the afterlife. So it was believed by the Egyptians that at some point after death, that body that you inhabited during life would be reanimated, and that body that you have in life is what you're going to spend your afterlife in as well. That's why it was important to preserve, particularly the kings and pharaohs' bodies. right? Because that body doesn't, you don't want that body to rot if it's what you're going to inhabit in the afterlife. And this is a piece of papyrus known as the Papyrus of Ani. This is one particular image from it that would have been painted circa 1500, 1400 BCE. This is depicting what was believed would happen upon arriving at the afterlife. So here we have Ani, right? This Papyrus of Ani would have been left in Ani's burial chamber, right? This is his cheat sheet so that he knows what he needs to do. So this is Ani down here who's being judged. He's being judged by the gods who you see up here sitting on high in their judgment seats, right? We have in the center of this whole thing a scale, a balancing scale. And on one side of it, Ani's heart has been placed. And on the other side, we have a feather. Ani's heart has been placed over here because the heart was believed to carry the weight of all of the bad things that you had done in your life. I mean, so that by putting your heart on one side and your feather on the other, if your heart is lighter than a feather, so that the feather side goes down, you were seen to have lived a good life. We have Thoth right here. He's one of the gods, and he is poised and ready to write down the results of what's about to happen here, right? And here's Ammit. Ammit, as you can see, he's another god, has a body that's made up of sort of a hippo and a leopard and a crocodile or a crocodile's head. He sits there waiting because if the heart is heavier than the feather and the scale falls on the heart side, then Ani is judged to have not lived a good life that is worthy of the afterlife, but has instead led a life that is worthy of being obliterated. And so Ammit here waits to eat that heart. If that heart is judged as having been bad in life, then Ammit gets to eat that heart, and poor Ani, or anyone else whose heart was eaten by Ammit, would be obliterated, completely and utterly ceasing to exist. It's not even a matter of like being sent to hell to suffer eternal damnation. You just no longer exist. You are gone. And that's a scary idea. And the Egyptians found that idea very scary. So you have Anubis here. And Anubis's job is to watch these scales. He's the one who's responsible for placing the heart and the feather on the scales and to watch to see which one is heavier and report those findings to Thoth there. Anubis, however, in this on this papyrus, and sometimes written on the walls of the burial chamber as well, are instructions. These are incantations that Ani can say that will convince Anubis to cheat and add a little bit of extra weight on the feather side here. So Anubis could be convinced to add a little bit of extra weight to pull the weight of that feather down, right? And then Ani, or whomever has been judged, having been judged a good person in life, could move on to the afterlife. The afterlife was often sort of seen as a place where life would just go on, not unlike it did here on earth. But this life that you move on to would be an eternal one spent doing the kinds of things that you want to do in your afterlife. So an illustration of this would be this image of Nabomun hunting birds from circa 1400 BCE. Now, again, I want you to note the style of art here. This looks almost identical to the kinds of art that we would have seen in the tombs of the Great Pyramids. There's a style here, and we'll talk about what this style sort of, what the style is all about, the classic Egyptian style of painting. But this would have been a wall painting on the tomb of Nabomun. He would have been a high-ranking person. He was not a pharaoh himself. And this is an image of how he wants to spend his afterlife. what Naboman wants is to spend his afterlife on a boat, fishing and hunting birds with his wife and his daughter. But now we're talking about the style of art that is classic Egyptian style, right? It comes, you know, what we see here, right? The thing that makes us instantly recognize that something is Egyptian comes from, again, the concern that perhaps the body itself, the body that's been mummified, what do you do if that body just, despite all the efforts of those who mummified it, it still managed to be corrupted and rot? Well, the soul can't go in and inhabit that rotten body, so it needs to find another vessel. And one of the things that was believed is that you could go in and inhabit the depiction of your body that was on the wall. And since you were going to have to inhabit that depiction of yourself on the wall, all of the parts of the body needed to be represented in the way that they were most recognizable. What do I mean by that? Well, the head, for instance, right? It is seen in profile because in profile the nose, the mouth, the chin are much more recognizable, right? If I turn my head this way, then when you're looking straight on, right, where all those features sort of get flattened. But although the head is in profile, the eye is shown as if it was looking straight out, because our eyes, again, are much more recognizable when we're looking at them directly, as you are with looking at mine. If I take my glasses off and then again turn my head, right, my eye isn't as recognizable as an eye, right? We don't see it as well when we're seeing it from the side. It gets distorted and perspective sort of changes the way it looks. So we get the eye represented as if it was looking directly straight out. Again, although the head is turned to the side, the torso, as you can see, is seen from the front, because that, again, is the most recognizable way to see the torso. If it was turned to the side, it's narrower, not as recognizable. And then the arms and legs are usually sort of outward and akimbo and shown in such a way that we can recognize them as arms, we can recognize them as legs. Feet are usually shown in profile because a foot is much more recognizable when it's turned this way than when it's pointing outward towards you, and you can barely even see the foot itself, right? So that right there, that all those things are meant to allow Naboman, if he has to inhabit his body. But then another thing that Egyptian art uses is something that we refer to as hierarchical scale. Hierarchical scale. This is a way of scaling, deciding upon the sizes of the things that you put into a piece of artwork based not on observation, but on the importance of the thing being depicted. What do I mean? Well, here's Naboman, right? He's right here doing his hunting on this boat. But notice that Naboman's wife is considerably smaller than him. That seems strange. And then his daughter, right, who hasn't necessarily been depicted as a toddler, right? She looks like she could be, at least in her adolescence, if not older, but she's been depicted in such a way that she's the size of a toddler, really tiny. And that's because hierarchical scale doesn't take into consideration the actual size of whatever is being depicted, but decides the size of any particular thing that's being represented by its importance. Now, Egypt was a patriarchal society, meaning that men were the ones who ran things. In fact, there was a woman who rose to be pharaoh in the Middle Kingdom, who a later pharaoh then wiped her name from the record. For a long time, we didn't know about her. But since it is a patriarchal society, Naboman himself, the man, and ergo in this society considered the most important of these three figures, is made very large. His wife, of secondary importance because she is a woman, is smaller, and his daughter, who not only is a woman but is also a child, is considered of least importance of these three. And so she is portrayed very small, right? That hierarchical scale, again, has nothing to do with reality, because in reality, right, Naboth and his wife would have probably been similar in height, right? Maybe she was a little shorter than him, but she wasn't this much shorter. She wasn't all the way down here. And his daughter, right, whatever age she might have been, she might have come up to about here on him. She might have actually been similar in size to what it portrays his wife to be. But this scale has to do with what was considered culturally important: man, wife, and then child. That concludes the conversation on specifically ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. However, I don't want you to think that they were the only ancient civilizations that were happening at this particular time. During the Bronze Age, and particularly when we talk about this area around the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, there were so many civilizations that popped up. The thing is, ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia were the ones who really survived this period that is known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. This is this period of time that took place in just half a century, just about 50 years, from circa 1200 to 1150 BCE, where suddenly a bunch of interesting civilizations that developed in this region collapsed. They were just gone. These cultures, like the Mycenaeans in what would eventually become ancient Greece, the Minoans, who are also in this area, the Middle Assyrian Empire over here, which is in the Fertile Crescent. It's, the Middle Assyrian Empire gone. The Kassites are the of Babylon down here. The Kassites, they would survive, but in a weakened form. The Hittites up here, the Hittites gone, just gone. The Ugarit gone. The Amorites gone, and even the new kingdom of Egypt. We talked about Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. The New Kingdom of Egypt survived, but boy, were they weakened. They had to, right? So people have talked about, like, why did this happen? Why did all these cultures just collapse? Many of which were just completely erased from the historical record because we lost their writing as well as some of their art and things of that nature. Some of them we only know about because other civilizations, the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, for that matter, wrote about them, so we know they existed, but they collapsed and they're gone. What happened? And it's a mystery. A lot of theories have been sort of thrown around, like there may have been sort of some sort of a climate issue that happened. Perhaps some of these kingdoms were just growing a little too large, couldn't quite hold themselves up. But there was also this really interesting group that is referred to as the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples. We don't know much about them. They were written about by the cultures that did survive, the civilizations that did survive, but they refer to them as Sea People. We don't quite know where they came from, how they arrived here, but there was suddenly this group of people. And when the other civilizations of the time write about them, they write about them in very scary terms. They were this group of people that don't seem to have had any like one leader that any of these other civilizations could point to, who just started showing up with this amazing naval ability, showing up with their ships, and just taking out city after city after city. So many of these cultures met their end as these Sea People came in and took over. And there is an amazing account written by the Egyptians of the big fight that they had. This as you can see right here, it says 1175 BCE. The Egyptians defeat the Sea Peoples. There's a really interesting written record of the Egyptians meeting these people here and how terrifying the encounter was, but the Egyptians did win, and there wasn't, like the Sea Peoples never made too much of an excursion into Egypt. But a lot of these ancient civilizations were wiped out as a result of the Sea Peoples, and those who sort of say there may have been some sort of climate thing that happened, say maybe there was some sort of ecological disaster like further on up in Europe rather, somewhere further north, and the sea peoples were trying to get away from that. And that they were groups of people who were survivors of whatever that was, and they all got together and they were working together to sort of conquer and colonize this area, if you will. It's fascinating because there's so much of the human historical record that's just gone, that we have no way of knowing what happened during this period, and we've lost a lot of what was important to those cultures as a result of this weird late Bronze Age collapse that happened. All right, so there you are. We are at the end of our discussion of the origins of human culture. You'll be getting some more information from Professor McIntosh. The next time you hear from me, we'll be talking about the ancient Greeks. And particularly, I'll be talking to you about, Professor McIntosh and I will both be talking to you about the ancient Greek philosophers. Okay, I think that is it. All right, yeah, all right. So take care. Happy first week of the semester. I'll see you soon. Bye.